Hello and welcome again to part 2 of Biomechanics of Exercise Application with Training Made Fun. Now we're going to be talking about forces on the body, and we refer to forces on the body, starting first and foremost with the concept that general idea that same forces that can move and stabilize the body have the ability to deform and injure it, as noted by Professor Newman, who wrote a book called Kinesiology of the Musculoskeletal System, referencing the simple idea that same things that can help us can also hurt us if we're not aware of the benefits and the risks of exercise that we are currently engaging. And that said, in understanding whether or not we're getting assistance or benefit from exercise as opposed to more risk, we have to first understand the internal forces, as we mentioned in the first video. Specifically, as we talk about produced by structures within the body. Specifically, our muscles are the active components of internal force production. Passive components, which means they can't produce force, they can resist against it. They can actually grow from force application, connective tissue, but this happens over time. Connective tissue is much, much slower to respond to stress than is muscle from a standpoint of hypertrophy, strengthening, and whatnot. So if we injure it, it takes a whole lot longer for it to heal than a muscle typically does, and certainly to really strengthen it, it takes a whole lot longer for that to really happen. In fact, to really maximize the strength of connective tissue, what we really need to have is, in the long term, to really maximize it, high load or high force output with low velocity. And that's not something you do right away, because high force output, meaning high maximal strength type exercise, is far too much for most people in the early phases of training. You're more likely going to ask for injury. They have to have control first. They have to have endurance first before we start worrying about things like that. But long term, that's how you strengthen connective tissue. Low velocity, slow speed with higher force outputs, right? Active and internal components, the actin and myosin, if you refer back to our kinesiology videos before, referring to the actin and myosin, the active components of muscle fibers, they are what basically help us exert or produce force in order to slow something down, speed it up, or hold it in place, okay? And then as far as external forces, we're talking about gravity, the pull of gravity pulling you down. If you're standing or if you're laying on your back, pushing something off you, it's pulling that load directly down. Gravity always pulls the same direction. It's pulling straight down. Okay. That said, we have to make sure that if we're doing anything where we're talking about external loaded in free space, dumbbells, kettlebells, body weight type exercises, TRX is a very common one. Anything, your barbells, anything where basically it's in free space. It's not attached to a cable or a band or a machine. And we're talking about anything that's going to be applicable to the rules of gravity very specifically from a standpoint that you better be really clear as much as possible. The engagement of your force application is consistent with the external force of gravity. If you're doing a squat or a lunge or a deadlift, when you're exerting force upward, it's best if you're going in alignment with the ground. If you're loading, make sure that load is going straight up and down. With your body weight, you'd step out if you're doing a lunge and step directly down. A squat, your shoulders have to line up over the top of the middle of your shoe. If you're lunging, if you're deadlifting, it's the same general idea. A lot of people think that it's okay to bring your hips or your shoulder way out in front of your feet when you're doing a deadlift. Well, if you want to maximize the benefit to your back, you don't want to do that. You could do it. People do it every day. Doesn't mean it's the most efficient or most effective way of doing it. It just means it's something that people do. There is a difference there. That said, going beyond body weight or external load exercises, don't be so generalized as to say things like, we work on body weight exercises before we do any external loading. That doesn't really make any sense, because from a lower body standpoint, that would make sense. You do a body weight squat or a in-place lunge or a motion of a deadlift before you start worrying about loading it up, because that's going to be much easier than adding load to your body weight. That makes sense. But the difference between putting 2 dumbbells in your hand, laying on a bench, 10, 15, 20 pounds maybe, or less maybe, than doing a push-up, the same general action of the joints, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to say they got to be able to do push-ups before they do laying on the back dumbbell chest press, or they got to be able to do push-ups if we do a machine chest press or cable chest press standing or band chest press, when you can make most of those upper body type exercises, including overhead presses, just about anything with upper body, you can make it easier than trying to do pure body weight loading exercises. And of course, we have to take into account angles relative to what we're working against, let alone the concept of what the person's capable of performing. But generally speaking, body weight exercises are generally easier for lower body, generally, and upper body exercises are generally easier when you're loaded as opposed to doing body weight exercises, right? That said, fluid or drag resistance, we talk about air and wind. When you run into the wind, it's like running up a hill. You're going to get the increased resistance coming at you. It's going to force you to push off harder. And when you push off harder, it naturally increases your stride length. What you don't want to do when you're trying to run or increase your speed is try to force an increased stride length. You want to lean farther out and push off and try to move more explosively. That will inherently, or more with more force, increase your stride length. The mistake a lot of people often make when trying to increase stride length, they try to force the issue rather than simply running up a hill or running into the wind or just lean forward more when they're running and try to push off harder. Those things will naturally occur. Okay. That said, when you're going downhill, it's like having the equivalency of having versus flatland, having the wind at your back. Same kind of concept. It's going to assist you rather than resist you when you run. You're going to be going a whole lot faster without a whole lot of effort, which is why when you do downhill type running, we're not so worried about how much wind you have at your back unless you're looking at track and field, trying to set a record, and they'll assess whether or not the wind was aiding you too much. But you're talking about downhill running, we have to take into account the fact that when you step out, and you go looking for the ground, your foot's looking for the ground, it's not there, it's below you. So the eccentric forces are so much higher here that the negative impact of landing on downhill running far outweighs the benefits if we're talking more than probably a very slight decline down. Generally speaking, very simple rule. If you have to change the mechanics of how you run, in other words, if you have to lean backward, if you're leaning backward when you run, trying to slow yourself down because momentum is increasing so much because of the downhill running, that downhill decline is far too steep for you. And most people, anything more than a few percentage points, single-digit percentage points below parallel, level ground, so to speak, is far too much for most people. That's really advanced type stuff, just like it would be advanced type stuff to have someone assisted running with you, holding having a band on you and they're faster than you. You're trying to keep up with them and they're pulling on you, so to speak. That's dangerous stuff if you're not ready for such things. Okay, so be careful with assisted type forms of running, but also be careful of resisted running. Running up a hill is one thing. Running with a parachute on your back or pushing a sled or pulling a sled, those are not beginner level things. If you don't already have good mechanics in the way that you move, don't add external resistance like we've said. You're much better off with a slight incline of a hill, so you work on the force output, the push off, to be able to engage higher levels of force so you can be faster, and mechanically your form will improve dramatically doing uphill running versus even on flatland sometimes, because you have to have good form or you don't get up the hill efficiently. What some people tend to call a self-teach for running technique. Something to consider, but you can't run for too far up the hill where your form breaks down. You can't try to run too fast up the hill. Those things where your form breaks down, that's not going to be helpful. It has to be within your ability to control your motion. But there's some good stuff there, right? Now, water resistance. When we're talking about you getting in the pool and moving around, water's pretty fabulous from the standpoint of every which direction you go, it directly opposes your resistance, your movement. Whereas gravity doesn't do that. Gravity pulls one way no matter what you do. And since water applies that resistance against you every which direction you go, because it surrounds your body when you're inside of it, it is not the same as force application on the ground. Do not make the mistake of trying to do strength training, explosive training in the pool and thinking you're going to get the same effects as you would on land. You're not. No matter what you think, you're not, for one simple thing, physics. Gravity is pulling straight down. The pool is resisting every which direction you go. There's very little transfer and benefit to trying to do the same action of squatting, jumping, running, lifting weights in the pool as there is on land. We do use the pool for rehabilitation. Someone has had some major stress or injury or health issue, getting in the pool where it's safer. You're not risking tripping and falling. You don't have the same potential risks that impact can have for some people, and there's nothing wrong with impact. Don't ever say such words as that impact's not good for anyone. That's just not true. There are levels of impact for every person, and if the only way we're going to build bone density and get stronger is to have impact to some degree. That said, the pool will reduce that. And there's a time and a place for that. Recovery days as well. Just working on overall mobility and trying to just move different directions, having that resistance a little bit there can be some good stuff for overall mobility and recovery and rehabilitation, all healthful type benefits. But from a standpoint of overall strength training that's going to benefit your performance on land, you got to be on land. That should not be shocking. That should not be surprising to anyone. Okay? It does not negate the water. Be very careful about that. Water is not good or bad. Land is not good or bad. What are you trying to accomplish, right? And that said, we got to use the water when it's appropriate to do so. And then elastics like bands. Bands, as much as they are very versatile and you can attach them to anything and you can push or pull, push facing away from that band, pull facing the band, pulling backward, doing high rows, low rows, all sorts of different motions you can engage. Bands are great for how versatile they are. Here's the problem with bands that we have to take into account. It doesn't make them good or bad, just take into account this drawback, if you will. The resistance increases dramatically as you pull on the band. Like any rubber band, any elastic. As you pull on that, the more you pull on that, the resistance increases. Whereas you do not work that way. You don't. Generally speaking, with a single joint motion, you don't get stronger from the moment you start pulling all the way through your full range of motion, from the beginning of your capable motion to the end of your capable joint motion. It does not work like that. You're going to have to go back to kinesiology a little bit. We're going to talk about this a little bit more in the application of biomechanics at the workshops to be able to break down one exercise versus another, because it's not as generalized as it's always tougher here, it's always easier here. It just doesn't work like that. It'd be nice if it did. It doesn't. And the fact is, most situations where you're doing a band exercise, a pulling exercise like a row, or a pushing exercise like an overhead press or a chest press or something like it, or let alone putting it under your feet and doing an arm curl, the resistance at the beginning is not that bad up through the beginning portion of your motion, which generally speaking in most single joint motions, we're talking about you getting stronger up to about mid-range or so. Then as you start pursuing toward end range in most situations, or in a lot of situations, you're going to be getting weaker as the band gets more resistance. And some people will say, that's good, right? Because where I'm weaker, the band challenges me more. You got to really rethink that statement. Why would you want the stress to increase as you get weaker? That actually makes no sense at all. So when you're strong, you want it to be easier. And when you're weak, you want it to be tough. That doesn't make any sense. When you're strong, the band should be more resistance. When you're weak, or when you can apply less force, the band should give you less resistance. That would make the strength curve and the resistance profile match up. That would make it a far more efficient, far more effective, far safer exercise with more implications for performance benefit than just challenging you in a place where you can't move well. And consequently, what happens? Form breaks down. You force the issue. You see that dramatic facial expression change that's showing you form is breaking down as we speak. You just can't see it. And consequently, seeing the body start to shake and go and start to use something else that you shouldn't be using. You're doing a shoulder motion. Next thing you know, you got the hips involved, the knees involved, something else involved there. That's great. If we're talking life or death situation, if we're talking about you're in the middle of a competition, you better move that weight or you're going to lose. Hey, it is what it is. But actually in performance training, in practice, in just betterment of getting stronger, getting fitter, getting more endurance, getting more powerful, it doesn't matter what it is, you got to be under control. And if it's going to cause you to be out of control by putting a band into a situation whereby you're going to go push too far into your ability to perform exertion of force, the band's not being helpful to you. Okay? Find a better place for using the band, or don't use the band for that particular exercise. Work equals force times distance. You want to do more work, which is really the general goal of strength. Strength is about producing force. When you're stronger, you can produce more force in a given movement skill. And we mentioned this in kinesiology, but you may have a strong leg, but the difference between you being able to kick a ball really far versus kick a ball very accurately versus be able to explosively kick in martial arts, let alone kicking accurately in martial arts, putting your foot where you're supposed to put it, as opposed to just kicking, let alone doing a squat or a leg extension, knee extension. Any of those things are very, very different, and you could be good at one and not necessarily the other, when they all have to do with leg strength and skill to some extent in their own way, in their own unique performance. That's the challenge ahead of us. To get the proper work, we have to find the proper force application, moved over a given distance. Then we also can talk about direction and what complicated joint actions we're going to engage along with it. There's a lot of things that go with it. Wish it was that simple. It's not. But from a general standpoint of just pure force production, if you increase your force production, you increase your work. If you increase the distance moved, you increase your work. If you have two people squatting or deadlifting in two side-by-side racks, one person's lifting half the weight of the other person. One person's got a 200-pound squat or deadlift. The other person's got a 400-pound squat or deadlift. And the 200-pound squat or deadlift person is going through a full range of motion for them, whatever that range of motion is. We'll talk more about this in some future aspects of biomechanics here. Whereas the person with the 400-pound load, it's very heavy for them as an example. This happens a lot in the gym. And the range of motion is reduced. If you have to reduce your range of motion to move the load, you proved one simple fact. You're not strong enough to move the load. If your normal range of motion in a given squat is 90 to 100, 110 degrees of hip flexion and knee flexion and ankle dorsiflexion getting to a proper motion as well, all those things, and you exceed range of motion capabilities at one given joint, you start to lose your form, you start leaning forward too much, you start rounding your back, or your feet shift outward, or your knees start to go out to the outside. Anything like that, we've shown you've actually proceeded below your ability to move with control. Consequently, you're more worried about the weight. So what then some people do then is, okay, no worries, then I won't go as low. All right, but if you didn't go as low as you normally could, you're losing that aspect of degrees of motion of your hip and or knee and or ankle joint. Consequently, you keep doing it on a regular basis. What you're going to find is you're going to get that tissue so tight, it's very, very difficult. And if you talk about enough years, a long time, you'll never gain that back, or you might not ever gain that back. And you're more likely to get hurt because you've lost range of motion because you're so focused on the amount of force you can produce. Produce force efficiently through a full, proper range of motion after determining what that full, proper range of motion is, and don't sacrifice it for a bigger weight. Okay? And that said, power is work over time. You want to be more powerful. Well, if you get stronger, you can produce more force, that will have an impact on power. If you can move it over greater distances, that will have an impact on power. If you can move greater masses, move it and accelerate it more, technically we can talk about mass times acceleration is force, right? And of course, distance, so we've got mad equals work, right? And we talked about mass times acceleration times distance over time is going to be your power, or the amount of force you can produce how quickly you can move it. That's velocity. It's even a simpler way of looking at it. How much force can you produce? But more importantly, can you move it more explosively? Because if you can produce a lot of force but not very fast, someone who can produce a lot less force but can do it a whole lot faster can be far more powerful. The most important factor when it comes to power, explosiveness, explosive quickness, you're talking about quickness, which is really just your initial activation of power, just the initiation of it, right? Whereas someone overall powerful may not have as much quickness right off the bat, instantaneous moment you produce it, but they might produce it, exert force significantly as they continue to go into a full range of motion or continue into the second and third stride or into the next rep or whatever it is. Don't confuse speed, power, and quickness, because they're all aspects of power, but they all have some slight variations there. Speed's one point to another point fast. Power is the ability to exert force quickly in less time, which is quickness as well, but quickness only applies to the first initiation of motion, okay? Or when you change direction and initiate that motion in a given direction. A faster person will eventually catch the quick person, but the quick person can react better, okay? They're both important skills. That said, you want to be more powerful? You know what you have to do with that load, with that force output? You can produce more force, that's fine, that's good, you want to do that, but you got to reduce the external load because you can't exert force quickly with significant load. And if whatever load you're lifting, when you try to jump or you try to run, if it changes the mechanics of how you move, it is an improper load for that particular motion. And we are flat out going to tell you point blank, flat out against the idea of you wearing a weight vest while you run or jump. If you're putting weights on your body while you run or jump or change direction, it's going to slow you down. Now some people say, well, that's good because it actually forces you to produce more force so you can change direction, then you take that vest off and then you can move quicker. Well, that's going to be arguable whether you actually move quicker, because the fact is it's going to change the mechanics of how you move. And if it does so, you're going to become less efficient, not more efficient by doing so. And if you want to do it for a brief moment to show someone the difference between having more load on the body, you're showing them a differentiation to help the body recognize that adding more load here is going to slow you down, take that load off, you're exerting the same amount of force, so now you're moving quicker. That's a fair recognition. But I wouldn't do 2 or 3 sets of loaded jumps with weight on your body. That doesn't make any sense. Can you already jump 36 inches in the air, 40 inches in the air? Can you already dunk? Can you already do those things? Then we can talk about adding resistance. You're much better off working on explosiveness with the force you have than trying to add more force. Okay? Important differentiation. We'll talk about part 3 of our videos with biomechanics up next.